Okay, so have you ever stopped to wonder why outsourcing your absolute most critical functions almost always seems to trigger a total systemic collapse? Right? Like, whether we're talking about a government relying on a private army, a huge tech giant farming out its core cybersecurity, or even a quant blindly trusting some black box trading algorithm, delegating your actual survival, yeah, it almost always backfires. Let's dive into why that is. Welcome to this explainer on the universal rule of delegated risk, where we are unpacking Chapter 12 of Machiavelli's The Prince. And look, before you tune out, forget the dusty 16th century history lesson, okay? Because what Machiavelli actually built here is this razor-sharp, remarkably modern mental model for incentive alignment and dependency fragility. Seriously, it's a universal rule that applies just as much to Silicon Valley AI infrastructure as it did to Italian city-states back in the day. So, that brings us right into Section 1, the mercenary trap. At the very heart of this is Machiavelli's core mechanism, which is called the force ownership doctrine. Basically, it states that a state or system survives only if the instruments of violence or power are structurally loyal to the system itself. Think of it like this. If you separate your power from your own identity and ownership, it becomes incredibly, dangerously unreliable the second it's put under extreme stress. It's like building a house on a rented foundation. To break it down, Machiavelli separated military systems into three main buckets: mercenaries, auxiliaries, and native or national forces. And his absolute boldest claim here, he said mercenary forces are literally the most dangerous. Why? Well, because their incentives are fundamentally disconnected from yours. I mean, they are basically the original quiet quitters. When you outsource your power, you are completely severing the force from the identity of the system it's supposed to protect. Which perfectly sets up Section 2, the psychology of loyalty. Now, take a look at the stark contrast in these incentives. On one hand, you've got a ruler who usually just wants a shortcut, right? They're seeking low-cost force production and security without doing the grueling work of actually building an internal structure. But on the other hand, the rented mercenary, they are optimizing purely for payment and personal survival. They're definitely going to avoid high-risk battles. This creates a massive asymmetry. The ruler is totally falling for what we call the delegated responsibility illusion, basically assuming a rented force operates exactly the same way an owned one would. And spoiler alert, it doesn't. The hard truth is, people fight for what they are emotionally tied to. People will sacrifice for identity and belonging far, far more reliably than they ever will for just a paycheck. We call this risk asymmetry behavior. Think about it. A mercenary is never going to die for your cause simply because losing a battle doesn't destroy their identity. If things go south, they just pack up and find a new client. It's just a transaction to them. Moving on to Section 3, the dependency doom loop. This is where things get really grim. It's a vicious, self-reinforcing, cascading failure of dependency. You start out at Step 1 with a weak native force. So, naturally, Step 2, you increase your reliance on mercenaries to fill the gap. But because you're renting that power, Step 3 hits. Your own internal capabilities atrophy even further. You stop developing your native force, which inevitably dumps you into Step 4, a fatal, deep structural dependence on that external force. You've essentially gutted your own core capabilities from the inside out. And that brings us to the absolute ultimate structural insight of this entire analysis. Outsourced force eventually optimizes for itself, not for the system hiring it. You know, whether we're talking about a 16th century militia or a modern corporate IT department, the loyalty chain always terminates in compensation. It never terminates in your shared success. Let's look at how this applies today in Section 4, Modern Mercenaries. Because honestly, this exact 500-year-old dynamic is literally everywhere today. Let's do a cross-domain transfer here. In trading systems, relying on outsourced signals or unmanaged leverage, it works perfectly right up until a market shock hits, the incentives completely diverge, and the system fails catastrophically. Or look at cybersecurity. Outsourcing your entire defense without building internal capability feels perfectly stable until a massive crisis happens. Suddenly, your provider's damage control incentives totally misalign with your company's actual survival. Heck, even in a game of chess, using tactical pieces that are totally disconnected from your overarching strategic plan gives you this short-term utility, but it creates a fatal long-term coordination weakness. All right, let's wrap this all up in Section 5, the universal survival rule. Now, to be completely objective here, Machiavelli wasn't flawless. We have to point out his blind spots. For one, he suffered from massive survivorship bias. He focused almost exclusively on the times when mercenaries failed catastrophically.
He also assumes monetary incentives are always inherently weaker than identity, and completely underestimated how external forces could become highly professionalized institutions. Plus, he pretty much ignores hybrid models where contracted forces are actually carefully integrated into a system's core ideology.
So here is the modern correction to his theory. Actually, outsourced systems can work. The act of outsourcing itself isn't the fatal flaw here. The fatal flaw is misaligned survival incentives. So if you can perfectly engineer those incentive structures so they're incredibly tight, well then external forces can actually become remarkably stable. So what's the blueprint to actually prevent a collapse? Here is your counter strategy. First, internalize your absolutely most critical capabilities. Second, painstakingly align any external operator's incentives directly with your system's actual survival. Third, you have to systematically reduce your deep dependencies on external operators. And finally, actively prevent those outsourced actors from accumulating autonomous power over you. They can never, ever be in a position where they calculate that their preservation is more valuable than yours. At the end of the day, Machiavelli's Chapter 12 isn't just history. It's a timeless masterclass in survival critical incentive alignment. The fundamental rule is incredibly simple. Never outsource the core function that dictates your survival. So, I want to leave you with this to think about as you look at your own startup, your business, or even your life today. What core function that actually determines your survival are you blindly outsourcing right now?